Hi, everybody. Welcome to Constitution Happy Hour. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here. How many of you, this is your first Constitution Happy Hour? All right, so about half the room. Well, so I'll explain a little bit about it. Constitution Happy Hour is kind of like a book club, but the book is the United States Constitution, which I hope you all got a copy of on your way in. The way it's going to work is we have a guest speaker who's going to speak for maybe half an hour or something like that, and maybe take questions throughout or lead a discussion afterwards. But I just want to do a little housekeeping before we start that portion. You can order drinks in the back of the room. We really encourage you all to share tables. A lot of people will come in late and they'll be looking for somewhere to sit. It's a great opportunity to make a new friend, invite them to come join your table. Please don't film during the program. We are filming this and we intend to put it on our website if we have our guests' permission. But when you hold up your camera, it's very distracting for the other people in the room, so please try and avoid that. And please make sure your ringers are off. We have pads of paper and pens available for you. They're on that back table if you want to take notes. We can also give you additional copies of the Constitution. There's other fun materials on those tables. We have the U.S. citizenship tests. I don't know about all of you. I know that I would probably fail that test. I don't know the answers to those questions, but if you want to test yourself, you can. There's also voter registration materials. I'm guessing you're mostly registered to vote, but you might know people who are not registered to vote, or you might meet them on the street, so feel free to take voter registration cards with you. So now a little bit about how this all started. There's a wonderful project called My Daily Constitution, created by the LA-based artist Linda Pollock, who's there in the back of the room. The idea of My Daily Constitution is to bring people together and engage in creative dialogues about democracy and society. Linda Pollock first began My Daily Constitution for a 2002 art exhibit called Democracy When? At the Lace Gallery, which was in response to the Patriot Act. Since then, she's initiated Constitution cafes in bars, libraries, cafes, parks, restaurants, churches, and other places where people gather, like museums. To quote Linda, "Our Constitution, our democracy is about interpretation, and interpretation means a collective, active dialogue, not just passive consumers and lawmaking producers. The U.S. Constitution is a living document, part of our quotidian life, influencing us in both large and small ways daily." So we're all here to read our own Constitution together and see how it's affecting our quotidian lives and be active participants in our own governance. Before we start, I want to just quickly give a really short recap of some of the past things we learned. For me, as a Constitution newbie, it was really helpful news to learn that the Constitution is divided into three main parts. This is really annoying. I'm going to hold it, sorry. The three parts are the preamble, then the articles 1 through 7, and then the amendments. The Bill of Rights is part of the amendments. It's amendments 1 through 10. All of this was news to me a few months ago. The preamble is actually just this very short and very beautiful paragraph. There's people who can't see, I think. Oops. Now they still can't see, I'm sorry. The preamble is just this: "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." That's it. For some reason, I thought the preamble was like a 6-page thing. The articles, as I said, there's 1 through 7, but there's really just 3 that you hear about all the time. Article 1 defines the role of Congress. Article 2 defines the role of the President, the Vice President, and the Cabinet. And Article 3 defines the role of the judiciary. So Trump has been talking a lot about Article 2, Article 2, Article 2, but if you didn't realize this, it would kind of run off your back, but now you know. So that's just the quick little refresher. Now I'm going to introduce our wonderful guest speaker. Our guest tonight is Jessica Levinson. She's a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she's also the founding director of the Loyola Law Public Service Institute, which trains the next generation of leaders in government service. Levinson studies the law of the political process, including election law and governance issues. Her work focuses on ethics, political corruption, voting rights, campaign finance, ballot initiatives, redistricting, term limits, and state budgets. Until last year, she served as the president of the LA Ethics Commission and previously served as director of political reform at the Center for Governmental Studies, which is a nonprofit research organization that looks at ethics and campaign financing. Now, we have a handout which is on that table, which I'm going to ask the ushers to pass out to the tables. Can you pass out the ivory-colored handout? We have a handout today that's going to help you follow along with Jessica's presentation, which is about impeachment, and what does the Constitution say about impeachment, and how do we interpret what the Constitution says about impeachment. It also has her bio on the back if you want to be able to look her up later. I guess that's everything I need to say, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming the one and only wonderful Jessica Levinson.
I'm so excited to be here. I have to say, I wish that I had this many students sign up for my classes when I teach the power of the presidency or the Constitution. I really want to thank Linda Pollock for doing this, for putting this together, for continuing to ask me to come back. This is an amazing thing that you created, interacting with the Constitution, and I'm really honored to be here. So, there has never been a time, I mean, I'm a law professor, I teach about the Constitution. I can't finalize my syllabus because every night something changes. And particularly this semester, I'm teaching a class called The Power of the Presidency. And I had a whole section on congressional oversight. And literally, I just had to wake up at like 4 a.m. and redo it that day because it was the day that President Trump said, nobody respond to subpoenas. And so we had to talk about what congressional oversight is. Is congressional oversight in the Constitution? Does it say congressional oversight anywhere? Doesn't say it. We just assume it based on the structure. Does it say separation of powers anywhere in the Constitution? No. Checks and balances? No, the Constitution is this genius, maddening document, and it doesn't have so many of the terms that we would think, like checks and balances, congressional oversight, separation of powers. We basically read into the Constitution what we think it should mean. So a couple of things. Our focus today is impeachment. That actually is in the Constitution. But oh no, that will be like the only time you're happy with me all night. It's going to be a lot of doom and gloom from here on out. So, but it's so vague. And so this is the thing about the Constitution. When it does use a word or a phrase, then it leaves it so much open to interpretation. It leaves so much open to discretion. Now, we know that you can impeach based on treason. Treason doesn't really mean what the president thinks it means. It means you have to be at war. Bribery, which we'll go through the elements of bribery, you'll notice that what happened in the last few days regarding bribery. Yeah, all of a sudden Nancy Pelosi used the word. She moved from quid pro quo to bribery. And then other high crimes or misdemeanors. This is the one where, if you're a lawyer, you can just bill hour after hour trying to determine what this means. So do you have to have committed a crime to be impeached? No. This is such a good, why am I here? This is such a good crowd. You don't need me at all. I'm just here for the jokes. So the question is, what does this mean? Now, first question, why not define this? Why not say these specific felonies or these specific misdemeanors? Yeah.
Context may change over the decades, centuries.
Yeah, exactly. So context changes, and then that means, yeah, interpretation changes. Maybe what we think should fall within this bucket changes. So the Constitution is this document that is like so maddening in terms of its vagueness, but it's so genius in terms of its vagueness because it means that the people who drafted the Constitution knew that it wasn't just for this year or this decade or this century. It was supposed to live far beyond anybody who drafted it, and so they allowed there to be discretion for the people who were going to implement it generations and generations later. Now, what's the problem with a vague standard, though? Yeah. It's hard to define, hard to interpret.
And the use of the word crimes is misleading, right? Because it doesn't have to be criminal.
Right. Crimes is misleading because you don't have to ever prove beyond a reasonable doubt anything. Impeachment is a different standard. It's a political standard. You do not have to be able to go into a federal court or a state court and prove any crimes. In fact, the president could commit crimes, but I think that they would not be impeachable offenses. So the problem with leaving things vague, not just in this case for impeachment, which is our topic, but other parts of the Constitution is it's what we just said in terms of the genius of it. It leaves it open to discretion. And with discretion comes potential abuse. And so I say this to my students, I'll say it to you, one of the things to take away from the Constitution is that it essentially assumes that people will adhere to some set of norms or accepted values. So, but, well, why are you laughing? That wasn't my punchline. So what have we seen? And let me say, I'm actually not a partisan. I'm not a registered member of either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. I really am just someone who studies the Constitution. So what have we seen for the last 3 years? It's been like a stress test on the Constitution, and we see where it breaks down. The Constitution assumes a lot of things, like if Congress institutes impeachment, that the people who obtain the subpoenas will actually respond to them. The Constitution assumes under executive power and executive authority that if you declare a national emergency, you won't do it for personal or merely political gain. The Constitution assumes that people will kind of push the boundaries, but not just like bulldoze down the walls. And, it's not our topic for today, but the 25th Amendment assumes that there's a fail-safe when a president so transgresses the bounds of what's normal. But it puts that fail-safe in the hands of the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to remove the president. And then again, it gives this maddeningly broad definition of you're unfit to fulfill the powers and duties of your office. Well, what does that mean? So let's get back to the Depression at hand. So the Constitution says treason, for reasons that we can understand, bribery and other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, why has Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff, why have they pivoted to using the word bribery over the last 3 or so days?
Most of America doesn't understand Latin.
Yes. And by Latin, we mean quid pro quo. So, which is hard for me to say, yes.
One more time for the dancers and
Quid pro quo. Now, does the president have to have committed a quid pro quo to have committed an impeachable offense? So what's the possible impeachable offense at hand?
Corrupt intent.
We, someone, anyone, right? So let's talk about the different tracks of, well, let's leave that for a second, actually. So why has Nancy Pelosi and why has Adam Schiff started talking about bribery? Because it's something we intuitively understand for the reasons that you all just talked about. Quid pro quo is not something that everybody grows up under knowing or understanding, but bribery is. If you do this for me, then I'll do that for you. That's what it comes down to. Other high crimes and misdemeanors, I mean, we talked about this. It gives all of this discretion to Congress to decide how to draw up articles of impeachment. So let's briefly talk about the process. If the president is impeached, is he removed from office? No, not at all. So think of impeachment. The House has the sole responsibility for impeachment. In order to vote to impeach, how many votes do they need? A majority or a supermajority? Just a majority in the House. Just a majority in the House. 50 plus 1%. And think of an impeachment like a decision about whether or not to indict a criminal. So if you think about somebody who might have committed a crime, what would happen is the police would investigate. The prosecutor might interview some witnesses, and then they would say, yes, there's enough to go forward. We're going to indict. Now, prosecutor, you have to go forward with a trial. The trial is where the Senate picks it up. So if you think about the impeachment like the process of from committing a crime to either in federal court we call it an indictment, or in state court we would call it a complaint or an information, then it makes a lot more sense for thinking about the arguments that have been used about the process. So nothing happens to you if you're a common criminal just because a complaint is filed against you. You don't go to jail. You don't lose your position. There's no legal consequence other than that you have to go to trial or have a plea bargain. Similarly, up until the time that a complaint is filed, you don't have things like the right to cross-examine, the right to put on witnesses, the right to have an attorney present in certain cases. So all this argument about due process during the impeachment has not been settled at all. There's no Supreme Court case that definitively says if you are going through impeachment, whoever is subject to the impeachment is entitled to due process. There's dicta in Supreme Court cases. Where does the due process inarguably kick in? For the Senate trial. Once you are, and if you think about it the same way of the analogy of the criminal case, once this trial starts, then you get your lawyer, then you get to cross-examine, then you get to assert your rights, but not up until the time a complaint is filed against you. Then it's completely different. So a lot of what we've heard this week has been complaints about the process. There's no integrity to the process. The process isn't credible. There's no due process. None of that is legally required. That's a good political argument. I think that's actually a very effective political argument. Maybe not to the room, but to the swing voters in the swing states, I think that's an effective political argument. Question?
What's the good argument? That he doesn't have due process, or that title?
Yeah, so sorry. I think a good argument that the House Republicans are making is there's something wrong with the process. There's not enough due process, it's not fair. There's a lot of, you can see there's a couple of buckets of argument that House Republicans have made. And one of them is we just can't trust what's going on here. But actually, the president has been afforded an enormous amount of due process, and there's been a lot of transparency. Now, so again, the decision of whether or not to impeach, that's just a simple majority of the House, And then nothing happens once the president is impeached. He can stand for re-election. He can win re-election. Once you go to the Senate, that's when you can potentially have repercussions. So what percentage of the Senate do you need to vote to convict? Yeah. Then you need a supermajority. And this is where you need at this point, Senate Republicans to cross party lines. If you vote to convict, that's when the real consequences kick in. That's when you're removed from office. That's when I think the better reading of the Constitution is you cannot later try and run for re-election or run for election again. So I would say keep those two processes separate. What happens in the House is impeachment, and they decide whether or not to drop articles of impeachment. And then what happens in the Senate is the trial and the potential conviction, which, how many people think the president will be convicted in the Senate?
40%.
This is a rough crowd. How many people think this president will be impeached in the House? I do. I don't think that Nancy Pelosi makes the announcement that we're going through a formal impeachment inquiry unless she's ready to drop articles of impeachment. So let's talk about sorry? Well, I've never been called that before. So let's talk about two related things. One is Nancy Pelosi's decision to say, I'm starting a formal impeachment inquiry. What difference did that make legally? What happens when they went, because before they were in a impeachment investigation, and then she comes out, it feels like approximately 6 years ago, I think it was 5.5 weeks ago, and she says, no, I didn't need glasses back then, it was bad. So, and then she says, we're having a formal impeachment inquiry. Legally, what difference does that make?
I don't think it makes.
Please wait for the mic.
It makes courts more likely to side with the case of the Congress in asking for information.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So what difference does it make? Congress had oversight authority before the formal impeachment inquiry. They have oversight authority after the formal impeachment inquiry. What changed is that Congress was investigating. They were issuing all these subpoenas. Subpoenas, again, are not dinner invitations. They're legally binding documents. You have to respond. And what is the response to these subpoenas? No. And no specific. And what, before the official impeachment inquiry started, what was the response? No, because it's not official, it's not impeachment inquiry, or there's no legitimate legislative purpose. Once you say formal impeachment inquiry, then a court is going to say, okay, that's your legitimate purpose. Congress, it's in the Constitution that you get to do this. So what does the decision to say formal impeachment inquiry do? Not all that much except supercharge the subpoena power. Then House Democrats had to make a decision, but let's pause for a question.
So when you say legislative purpose, is that for the purpose of the legislature or the purpose for drafting legislation?
Legislature. So let's talk about it. Congress does a couple of things. They draft legislation. I'm never going to remember what my other point was, but they draft legislation, and then they also do what? Oversight. Who controls the purse strings? Yeah, so they can investigate, determining whether or not their appropriation of money is being used for a good purpose. So their investigations don't always have to be because they're about to draft a piece of legislation. It can be because they want to make sure that the government's purse is being used well, or because they have oversight authority over the president, which again is not directly in the Constitution, but we read it in. And so it doesn't have to be that a piece of legislation is pending. It can be that this is about making sure that we're using our money well, or making sure that the Constitution is being upheld, like maybe there might be an emoluments clause violation. Hand in the back? No, okay. It really throws me off if you move at all. So, yes, there was a hand in the back.
Yeah, could you talk about the subpoenas you started to mention? They're obviously not being blocked, and then what's the supercharged subpoena?
So the supercharged subpoena is once Nancy Pelosi says formal impeachment inquiry, then whenever somebody wants to go to court and challenge a subpoena, Congress's response is impeachment inquiry. Congress's response isn't, well, we're looking into whether or not money is being well spent, or we're looking into whether or not we should draft legislation dealing with an ethics code for the president. It gives Congress a much stronger legal footing to say, we need it. We need it because we're in an official impeachment inquiry.
And who enforces it?
A judge. So, so let's talk about what happens if you refuse to comply with a subpoena. Congress has a couple of options. They can decide to, door number one, use their inherent powers of contempt. They very rarely do that. They can ask the sergeant in arms to arrest somebody. That hasn't happened since, I think, the mid-1930s. I don't remember anything else other than the mid-1930s. Congress can decide that politically, it's better to just put it to the side and say, we're impeaching based on two different things. We're impeaching based on the potential crime, which we'll talk about in a second, and then we're impeaching based on you screwing with the impeachment process.
Obstruction.
Right. Obstruction, witness tampering from this morning, etc. And then, door number three, they can decide to go to federal court. So Congress can go into federal court and sue, and then you get randomly assigned to the federal judge who's quote unquote on the wheel in that district. It called because they used to literally like spin a wheel depending on what the judges in that district. And then you say to the judge, this is why we need it. We need it because of impeachment inquiry. I think that legally speaking, House Democrats stand on very, very strong legal ground in issuing these subpoenas. I think that politically they've made a calculation that door number two is better.
Which was?
Impeach partly based on thwarting the impeachment process. It's the meta impeachment, right? I mean, so, in terms of what happens when you refuse to comply with a subpoena, Congress can use their inherent contempt powers. Congress can say, we're going to try and impeach you in part based on your refusal to comply, or Congress can go to federal court. Now, the Trump administration has made some really interesting legal arguments about subpoenas. And President Trump's lawyers has said things like, you cannot investigate a sitting president. That is a startling claim in the sense that, one, that's not anybody's understanding, but two, when you make that claim, and I always say this to my students, don't think about whether or not you like President Trump. Think about whether or not you want the next president to be immune from investigation. For so many of these arguments, it's really important to think. I mean, when I talk about the National Emergencies Act, do you want the next Democratic or Republican president to have this much power? Not President Trump, but the next person in the Oval Office. So, all right, so that's what can happen if you fail to comply with the subpoena. Now, let's go back for a second and say, we said there's basically two tracks of impeachment here. There's the kind of substantive potential crime, and then there's the crime of failing to comply with the impeachment. What's the substantive crime at issue here? Yeah, the bribery. It's what we started with. which is somewhere around here. And specifically what?
Asking for investigation to Biden in exchange for military support.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about that. Do we have a transcript of the phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky? We have a summary of the transcript. We don't have the transcript, we have a summary of the transcript. So President Trump on the phone call never, of course, says, I understand you want military aid. I would like something from you for personal political gain. Because nobody ever talks that way. And I think we do ourselves a huge disservice by pretending that we were going to see that in the transcript. So what happens, the context is everybody knows that the Ukrainian government wants military aid. Everybody knows that that's in the background, that that's on the table. And President Trump has a phone call with President Zelensky, the president of the Ukraine, and says, I really think that you should do this thing, and keeps coming back to it and keeps looping back. I keep hearing about the Bidens. I think you should look into the Bidens. I think that there's something really strange going on with the Bidens, and you should be the person looking into it. Now, let's stop there for a second. Let's pretend that there was never military aid on the table. There was never any potential quid pro quo. President Trump has a call with the president of Ukraine. There's nothing that the president of Ukraine wants from us, but President Trump keeps saying, I really think you should look into the Bidens. Is there a potential crime there? Yes. Yes, there is a potential crime there. It's a federal election law violation. Yes. So what's the potential crime? It's asking a foreign government for a thing of value. We heard about that a lot with respect to the Trump Tower meeting in June 2016. If you ask not just a foreign government, but any foreign national for a thing of value to help your election campaign, that is a federal election law violation. Now, do we know for sure that announcing or commencing an investigation into Vice President Biden is a thing of value under federal election law? Yeah, we don't know that because we don't have the case on that, but that is absolutely the rational reading of the Federal Election Campaign Act. So, yes.
Do you think, would that be permissible in court? Would that be like proof in court, like at a criminal level?
Is there enough here if it wasn't a sitting president to go to court and say, I think there's a federal election law violation? I think there's a ton of assistant U.S. attorneys who would be really excited to take that case. These are not slam dunk cases, though. I mean, these are hard cases to prove. So campaign finance law isn't just about, I want a check from you. The Ukrainian government announcing an investigation into Vice President Biden and or his son, Hunter Biden, is way more useful than $200 from a Ukrainian national. But the $200 would clearly be a campaign finance violation. We know what to do with the $200. That's money coming in. We think we know what to do with the please announce an investigation. So in terms of the substantive crime, part one is you don't need a quid pro quo. All of this discussion about quid pro quo, what about the military aid? What about the meeting in the White House? It's so beside the point. You could absolutely have a campaign finance violation without anything on the table, just President Trump asking for a thing of value from the Ukrainian government. Okay, so second substantive crime is this issue of bribery or extortion or quid pro quo, where the president says, but of course doesn't say explicitly, I understand you want your military aid, I want my investigation into a political opponent. So those two tracks are the kind of substantive, again, crimes that the impeachment is focusing on. And then there's a separate track of articles of impeachment that I think will be based on you didn't comply with the impeachment process. This is the failure to adhere to the subpoenas. This is the intimidating the witnesses. These are all of the things that impeded the impeachment investigation. And so I think that there will basically be two big buckets of articles of impeachment. The first one is, again, the campaign finance violation and bribery or extortion. And then the second one is obstruction of the process itself. Any questions so far?
There's one question here.
Over here, side. Hi.
Hi. What about the emoluments clause question?
Yes. So what about the emoluments clause? There's actually a foreign emoluments clause and there's a domestic emoluments clause. And what the foreign emoluments clause basically says is, well, it's actually terribly written. It doesn't actually expressly apply to the president. And there's a professor in Norway who says, well, if they wanted to apply it to the president, they would have written it, because in other parts of the Constitution, they write president. And this just says any officer. The best reading absolutely is that this applies to the president, but it says the president can't have an emolument from a foreign government. It doesn't define what an emolument is. Again, because the Constitution is so maddeningly vague in a way, but we understand it to mean a thing of value. Does it mean anything of value, even if it's a fair market deal? Or does it mean just a sweetheart deal? We don't know the answer to that question. Does it have to be that the president himself is benefited from a foreign government or foreign person, or that his company, controlled by other people, benefits? We don't know the answer to that. So the emoluments clause is basically a constitutional anti-corruption clause, in the sense that it says, don't get things of value from foreign governments. We don't trust that. And there have been a couple of different lawsuits about the emoluments clause, and the best arguments that have been made for these is that it's brought by, for instance, people who lose business because foreign dignitaries aren't going to their hotels anymore, they're going to the Trump hotel. So they can say, I have a specific harm, it's a pocketbook harm, and you need to enforce the emoluments clause. The problem is that federal judges have said, I don't know if that's enough of a harm for federal court. So a lot of these lawsuits are being tossed out. But I take your question maybe more to mean like, why aren't we impeaching on the emoluments clause? And I think that's actually a political calculation that Nancy Pelosi decided. There are separate lawsuits going on about the emoluments. It's kind of hard to define, and it's something that surrounds the president, but this phone call between President Trump and President Zelensky, he's at the center of it. So what's different, I mean, there's a lot of differences from the Mueller investigation to this issue with the Ukraine, but one of the differences is we're not circling the president. He's at the center of this. The Mueller investigation, there were a lot of people who were connected to the president. Roger Stone. I looked at a picture of him today. I was like, I have those sunglasses. And they were convicted for things, but not necessarily related to the campaign, just for being bad actors. So in answer to your question, I think that Nancy Pelosi decided that this is going to be pretty narrow, and that this is going to be based on a story that people can understand. President Trump saying to President Zelensky, what, do something for me. Now let's stay on quid pro quo for a minute. Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, says, we engage in quid pro quo all the time. That's how we conduct foreign policy. Get over it. Is he right? Yes. Yes and no. Yes. You nailed it. Exactly right. We engage in quid pro quo all the time. That's how we conduct domestic policy. That's how we conduct foreign policy. That's how think about how you would try and get votes for a piece of domestic legislation. Oh, I really want your vote on the gun bill. Do you think that you can vote on the environmental protection bill for me? What's different is what Mick Mulvaney is saying. We always say, if you want your money, you have to do something for us. We don't want to misuse our money. You have to prove to us that it's going to be well spent. You have to prove that you're not a corrupt country. That's true, but that's not what President Trump was asking for from the summary of the transcript. What he's asking for is, I need something for my personal political gain. That is just substantively different. Yes?
Please wait for the mic.
You don't give foreign aid to countries that have governance. You give that have governance. You give countries that are clean. I recall last year in the Netherlands, for instance. I do see it in Pakistan. Pakistan more corrupt than the Netherlands.
Yeah. So the president has absolutely not just the authority, but the responsibility to make sure that our taxpayer dollars are well spent, that they're not misused in corrupt countries. Let's put a little asterisk there for a second, sorry. So if the Ukraine is so corrupt, who should we be asking to investigate Joe and Hunter Biden? Yeah. So this idea of, look, and let's say this, would Hunter Biden have gotten that position if his last name wasn't Biden? No, and that's so beside the point. And Hunter Biden and Joe Biden could have engaged in crimes. I don't think that they did because there's no evidence that they did, but they could have, and that is totally besides the point. So, yes, I said let's put a pin in that.
I'm sorry, can you speak into the mic, please?
Thank you. So I was still stuck on the quid pro quo.
Yes.
And my understanding, or at least my outlook to it, is that if I'm engaging in a quid pro quo between countries or between, lobbyists or whatnot, you have this degree of discretion on what you're offering back. So there is a conversation, this is, you don't like this, I'm gonna offer this other thing, until we negotiate something that maybe works out for our, tit for tat. But in this case, seems to me that there is no discretionary, like Ukraine either. You give me the investigation or else. It's like, I'm asking you and I'm not gonna release the money, I'm not gonna do unless you give me that specific thing. So, that is more like a mafia kind of thing. Like, I know where you live.
So I would say that specific, so yes, but saying I'm not going to do this for you unless you do this specific thing, I think is entirely appropriate if this specific thing is what we need to ensure that American taxpayer dollars are well used, or that there is a specific public good that we need, and there's no way to make sure we get it unless you do that specific thing. This specific thing is not acceptable if it's help me with my re-election campaign. Yes. Please speak into the microphone.
Sure. I've got two questions, actually. One is, seems to me that what's at issue here is not a case of bribery, but a case of extortion. So one question is that a semantic distinction politically or legally meaningful in your view? And the second is, why doesn't Congress use its contempt of Congress more fully?
Yeah. I'm going to probably not really answer either question, but so... No, but they're really good questions. So this issue of bribery versus extortion, I actually think that you're right, that if you were in a court of law, that what the summary of the transcript based on the phone conversation looks to me like it's closer to an extortion. It doesn't matter for these purposes because you don't have to have the type of proof that you would need for a federal courthouse. You don't need to draw up an information like you would have in federal court. And so I think politically it's more useful to say the word bribery because one, it's in the Constitution, and two, it's in the Constitution. And people kind of get it. Extortion, I think, feels a little bit more amorphous, but if you're a federal prosecutor, is probably where you would go. And then the second question, the kind of spinelessness, let's say, potentially of the House Democrats, or why doesn't the House use its contempt powers? Yeah, it very, very rarely does, and I think that they feel like this is the ultimate contempt power, which is, well, then we're just going to impeach you. Now, you know, the other thing is, I'm going to not be as articulate as I should be about this, but to really enforce the contempt powers, you sometimes have to go to the Department of Justice. And so I was hoping to kind of avoid this landmine of me not really explaining this well, but Congress can say, I'm using our inherent contempt powers to hold you. I'm using our inherent contempt powers, but then who enforces it? You often have to ask the Department of Justice. And I don't think the Attorney General has any appetite for this.
Please wait for the mic.
It doesn't have its own jail.
Doesn't Congress have its own enforcement mechanism, like a police or?
Yes, you have the sergeant in arms, but then where does the sergeant, like, the sergeant's got you. Yeah, where, like, you know, you have to sit with Jim Jordans for the rest of your life. Like, what's the, you know? So you have to get somebody to say, like, yes, you can go into a federal prison. And that somebody is usually the Department of Justice.
Well, I don't know if it's tangential, but when, hello. What, is this an okay level? Yes. Thank you. You know, you don't want to swallow the mic because it's like, so in regards to contempt, I don't know if this is tangential, but when you mentioned the subpoena, I remember several years back that Dick Cheney was quite famous for turning away soldiers or police, or I forget who, delivering subpoenas to the House door. And that sense of nihilism that it engenders in people of all classes, I think, is what makes this impeachment process very hard.
Yeah.
So you talked about Nancy Pelosi's decision to mount an inquiry and the transcript or the summary of the conversation. And this is, I'm asking you to go beyond a little bit about what you're talking about. Do you have a sense that when she did that, she knew what Taylor was going to say or Obanovich was going to say? I mean, those were pretty stunning revelations that went beyond what was in the summary.
Yeah, so the question is basically, did Nancy Pelosi know there was going to be more there when she said formal impeachment inquiry? I mean, that's kind of a political calculation. I think I'm no better suited than anybody else in the room to make it. I mean, I was on election night talking about, you know, President Clinton and which federal judges she was going to appoint, so I'm not really good at making these predictions, but pause for tears. So... No, I mean, in answer to your question, a lot of people actually have asked that. I go up and back on that. It's a great, great question, and I don't know what the answer is. I think for her, she couldn't hold the caucus any longer. And it's interesting. I mean, people did say at that moment, like, why was this the straw that broke the camel's back? I mean, could you have impeached based on the Mueller report? Sure, but in which part? Part one about potential conspiracy between the Russian government, obstruction, part two.
I think they're going more on the court of public opinion, because that's what, I think right now it's all about the court of public opinion, and they're being political about it because that's how all of the, you know, the Republicans are they know, and they're all talking about it behind closed doors, how crazy this president is, but they know their constituents are equally crazy about this president. So they care more about getting reelected than they do about anything else. So that's why the court of public opinion is what's most important, which is why I think Pelosi and Schiff are using the word bribery, because it's in the Constitution. So when people see that on TV, they're like, oh, this word is in the Constitution saying this is a reason for impeachment. Because we have to take it literally with a lot of these people because of all the craziness going on right now.
So, yeah, I would say, yes, impeachment is a political proceeding. It's not a legal proceeding. So all these arguments about like, well, where's my due process? This is a political proceeding. There's not a lot of rules. We don't have a lot of precedent. Luckily, we don't have a lot of experience in this area. You wouldn't want us to have a ton of experience in this area. And I think that's right. It's interesting. I was here, where's Claudia? How long ago did we do the impeachment form? Oh my God. I was gonna say, a couple of months ago I was here and we did the impeachment form. And we talked about what will change with public hearings. And I think that this is the only potential moment where public opinion could change, because there really aren't that many new facts. It's just facts corroborating the story. And the only thing that would change the outcome in the Senate is if the Republican base starts to say, I'd rather have Pence. Like, enough of this. I want Pence going into the 2020 election. There's Valium in the back. All right, so, okay, so it's 7:05, and I think I was supposed to talk for 30 minutes. All right, so should we keep going? All right. My mom paid everybody. That's really nice. So, all right, so what do you want to do next? The next page is bribery, actually, but we already talked about it. Now, this is the problem when it comes to President Trump. So, you need a public official. President Trump is the elected president of the United States. A thing of value. What's the thing of value? Please look into my opponent, Vice President Biden, and his family. So it's at the time of the conversation. Good question. A request or receipt by that public official for a thing of value. Again, we have to assume that investigation is the thing of value. Made for the benefit of that official. Yes, I think it's easy to show why that would help his reelection campaign. With a corrupt intent. Yes. So what does that mean? Now this, by the way, what other statute does this appear in with a corrupt intent? We just talked about the Mueller report. This is a bonus round. Obstruction of justice. Why didn't Donald Trump Jr. in some ways get indicted? Because we weren't sure he knew what was the law. So this has been the issue with President Trump, which is demonstrating that he knew what he was doing was not just morally questionable, but illegal. And that he formed the requisite mental intent, and that he went forward with that action. Now, yes?
So sorry, please wait for the mic.
Thank you. Does Rudy Giuliani's presence in this whole Ukraine situation help prove the corrupt intent?
I'm gonna just put a star next to Rudy Giuliani. I've never thought about that. Does his presence help show a corrupt intent? Yes, so how is Rudy Giuliani been described on Wednesday and Friday in the public hearings? People have said there are regular channels of conducting foreign policy, and then there are irregular channels. And Rudy Giuliani is now that irregular channel. Is it illegal for a private citizen to conduct foreign policy? Well, there's an old federal law called the Logan Act, and it says that I can't just go and say to, the Prime Minister of the UK, I have this idea. I'm an American. I represent the American government. I think that we should talk about it. And the idea is that foreign governments have to know who they're talking to. They have to know if you have the force and effect of the United States, if you're a representative of the United States. Now, I think there is a Logan Act violation with respect to Rudy Giuliani, but there's this weird kind of murkiness because apparently President Trump said, go and act on my behalf, or go and act on behalf of the American public. Those are two different things, right? Go and act on my behalf is you're a private citizen, you're my lawyer, and in which case you can't conduct foreign policy. Go and act on behalf of the American public, is that deputizing Rudy Giuliani to essentially be part of the State Department? Well, yeah, so we don't know what those conversations were. The amount that we know about Rudy Giuliani and who was paying him and why he was in the Ukraine when he was in the Ukraine is so small. I mean, I was on the radio a couple hours ago and the host said, why don't they just call Rudy Giuliani in? And if he ignores the subpoena, which he will, then that's another reason to impeach. Yeah.
Has President Trump ever described Rudy Giuliani as anything other than his personal attorney, to your knowledge?
I don't.
And isn't that relevant?
I feel like Marie Yovanovitch. To your knowledge, has he? I don't think so. So I don't know, because there's been so much kind of mixed reporting about, well, no, Rudy was acting on behalf of the American people. No, he was acting on the president's behalf just as a private attorney. So.
But Trump's references to him are relevant in this, right?
Yes, absolutely. The reason I'm pausing is because I think there are many conversations that we just don't know about. Now, the question about does Rudy Giuliani there show that you could form a corrupt intent? I mean, to me, it's just Rudy Giuliani is like this dumpster fire, but we're not exactly sure what lit it. And so maybe, but we need to get, there's one other thing that was brought up, but yes. Mike?
I have a question. over here. So I have a two-part question, actually, because of that. Is the president allowed to do that, to just deputize someone and say he's working on behalf of the American people now, without?
Yeah, well, a lot of people can act without confirmation. We've never had so many acting fill-in-the-blank officials. Mm-hmm. I mean, even Mick Mulvaney never got the title of chief of staff. I mean, and look at the cabinet, so many acting. So the question of, can the president just wave a magic wand and say, you're acting on behalf of the US government now? You can't just have that conversation, but if he had a conversation with members of the State Department and they acquiesced, then maybe. Again, the reason I'm hedging is we just don't know about the vast majority of those interactions.
Okay, and then to go back to the corrupt intent, you said Donald Jr., the conversations at the hotel, at Trump Tower, no one knew what his intent was. You couldn't prove corrupt intent, but because you didn't know if he knew the law. Why does that matter? Like, if I get pulled over and I'm like, well, I thought the speed limit was 100. I didn't know the law. Like, that doesn't matter in any other situation. They should know the law if they're going to be working for the government and the American people.
So this is a great, great question, which is, you got applause for that question. So the question is basically, ignorance of the law is no defense, right? Well, sometimes it is. So if you have a specific intent crime, then ignorance of the law is a defense. Blowing the speed limit is a strict liability crime. You don't have to know it. You just have to violate it. Specific intent crimes. So if you, for instance, the campaign finance violations, in order for those to be felonies, you have to know that you're breaking the law when you're asking for a thing of value from a foreign government. It was not at all clear that Donald Trump Jr. was aware of federal election laws. And I think that's largely why there was no indictment in that case. For obstruction, similarly, you have to show an awareness that what you're doing is not just improper, but illegal. And so, again, ignorance of the law sometimes is a defense because we think that the penalties are so high that we want to make sure that you knew what you were doing and that it was wrong.
I guess my question is an extension of the last one. I understand saying that Donald Trump Jr. or even candidate Trump didn't understand the law and didn't have specific intent. But if you're the head of the executive branch and your job is to execute the laws, how can you claim that you don't understand the laws?
Well, and one more on that, which is once you've had this whole discussion about the Trump Tower and asking for a thing of value from a Russian national, does it really pass the laugh test to claim that President Trump isn't aware of federal election laws? So, you know, in terms of the federal election violation, you know, separate from the quid pro quo, I think, no, the ship sailed on President Trump claiming he doesn't know the law because of the Mueller report. In terms of the quid pro quo, I think it's a very good case. Meaning, I think prosecutors would have a very good case against the president if this was in a criminal court. But, you know, could the president say, I mean, what has been his defense? Well, I didn't want to send taxpayer dollars into a place where there was questions. And I can ask them to do things for me at the same time. But those things that benefit me benefit the American public. And I don't think it's a good defense, but if you look at what we've seen from the House this week, it's a defense.
Yes. Would you consider his tweets this morning witness tampering?
Yeah, so I'm going to say two things. One is I think that could be enough for witness tampering, but two, you don't need to be able to prove it. So for an impeachable offense, you don't need to be able to prove a crime. And so I absolutely think that could be added to the articles of impeachment. This idea that he's telling people don't comply with the subpoenas, which, by the way, hasn't been all that effective. A lot of people have said, like, no, I'm going to comply, I'm going in. And then some people have said, no, I'm going to comply. Some people have said, there's no way I'm going to comply. And then some people have done what? Yeah, have said, I can't possibly decide between two competing branches of government, so I'm just going to have a federal judge decide, hoping to run out the clock on this impeachment proceeding.
I have a political question more than a legal one, and that is, so Trump is so interested in Ukraine, but he has, to my knowledge, expressed no similar interest in corruption in any other country. Politically, is that not a powerful observation for the Democrats?
I think so. I mean, what's the best thing that House Democrats could have done at the end of this week? What should be their goal? That's a purposely open-ended question. I think their goal is that you can go to Thanksgiving dinner and tell your Trump-supporting cousin in 3 sentences why Trump should be impeached. But it's not actually, there's been so many questions and so many, I mean, House Republicans have essentially defended by saying we don't like the process. We think that the Bidens did something bad. And it's in what? Even if it's quid pro quo is okay. And people have said, like, well, wait, maybe there's kind of something to that. And I think that the House Democrats haven't, there isn't the elevator speech. So I kind of answered your question and I kind of didn't answer your question, which is, I don't know how much more the House Democrats want to say, so much as there really should just be two main paragraphs. One is impeaching on the substantive crimes, and two is impeaching based on thwarting the impeachment. Yeah.
I realize that most of us in this room are all on the same page, so I'd like to bring in something, an opposing view.
Yes.
I read an editorial in the Wall Street Journal this morning, or I think it was yesterday's paper, and they were trying to take something that President Obama did and try to draw an analogy to what President Trump is doing and saying, oh, come on, this is all political. I don't remember the exact words, but they said right before the 2012 election, President Obama communicated with someone in the Russian government, and he said to Putin, look, tell Putin not to ask for this benefit or something before the election because they're all thinking I'm soft on Russia. But if he waits till after the election, then I can make the deal with them. And they said that, that's all that Trump is doing, so this is purely political. I wonder how you would respond to that.
Probably not well, because I didn't read the editorial, but I would say that I think I'm familiar with the instance that you talked about, which is President Obama is basically saying kind of, wait, we'll do this deal later. I promise this will happen later. To me, again, doing a deal or postponing a deal isn't until after the election isn't necessarily illegal. The question is, what's the deal? President Trump is making a deal that's benefiting him personally, not the American public. I mean, he could have, I think there's a straight-faced argument that he could say, to the president of Ukraine, I really want to give you this military aid, but it's just going to kill me in the polls. I think it's really good for both countries, but I can do a better job if we wait till after the election. I can do a better job for the people of Ukraine. I can do a better job for the American people. But this is help me for my personal political gain. This feels just substantively and qualitatively different from that.
I think they were trying to say that Obama was kind of saying, I would have a better chance in the election if you just hold off.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's interesting. I mean, is it a slippery slope to say, like, this would really help me in my reelection, or pointing out the political realities of I have to appear a certain way before the election? I mean, I could see, if I were up here with one of my conservative friends, I could see them saying, well, it's just a spectrum. It's just a matter of degree in terms of difference from saying we should wait because it will help me versus you should investigate Vice President Biden because it will help me. It still feels to me like even if it's a spectrum, it is different.
Yeah, I have two issues over here.
Hi.
Hi. One of them is I'm going to 25, the Constitution 25. And that is maybe we can use, if Donald Jr. was ignorant of possibly what he was supposed to know for dealing with his issue, then maybe we should deal with, maybe Donald Trump is really totally unaware of anything that he's doing, ergo he is completely unacceptable in having this office. I mean, it appears that he really is.
So the 25th Amendment, Section 4 of the 25th Amendment deals with how to remove a sitting president who doesn't want to be removed. The first couple of sections, basically the president dies, the president's incapacitated, but the Section 4 deals with involuntary removal. And wait, we don't have to go on memory. So let's go based specific. You all have constitutions. So let's go specifically on the phrasing. I think it says, unable to fulfill the powers and duties of your office. Unable to discharge the powers and duties of your office.
25, page 37. 37. Page 37.
So, what happens? The vice president and a majority of the cabinet say to have a written declaration, and I apologize, I'm going on memory, and they send it to Congress, and they say the president is unable to discharge the power and duties of his office. And then what happens? Can the president contest that? Yeah, he can say, no, I'm okay.
Of course.
He can say, I'm good. What are you talking about? I spend all this time golfing. I'm fit as a fiddle. So then Congress has to act as a tiebreaker. And Congress has to then vote and say yes or no. He is unable or he's not unable. The House. And then if it goes against the president, he can, and I don't remember how many days, but he can keep contesting it. He can basically keep forcing a vote I think it may be every 21 days.
Go ahead.
And that is really messy. So I guess a couple of things to ask for that. I mean, one is, who should be in charge of making that determination? And two, what should the standard be? I mean, that is, again, we talked about vague standards. That's a really vague standard. So to your question of, aren't we there, basically? Yeah, at the Hammer Museum in West LA, sure. But, imagine what would happen to the country where you have a president who's never going to go below about 35 to 36 approval ratings percentage, and half of the country says, I don't see it. No, he's strong, he's fine, he's just fighting off all these witch hunts. Nobody wants to work anymore. Nobody's been subject to this type of terrible treatment. Sorry? Is this the part where we transition to the Second Amendment? You don't want me for the Second Amendment. You want Adam Winkler at UCLA for the Second Amendment. So, in trying to answer your question more seriously, I just don't think it happens because of who has to pull the trigger. It has to be Pence and then a majority of the cabinet who are picked by the president. Now, they have to initiate it, I think. So Congress can create a statute. Congress could pass a statute saying, I believe this is how it works. Congress could pass a statute saying we're using our authority in the 25th Amendment, and here's the other body that's going to make that determination. Now, why would the drafters of the 25th Amendment have said it should be the vice president and a majority of the cabinet? And we think those are the people the president interacts with. They're going to know. The problem, of course, is that there's an inherent problem because the president is their benefactor. I don't know where the microphone is.
I have another part two to my separate. I cannot understand why time after time after time every subpoena is denied and ignored. Constant. I just don't get it. Everyone, with no repercussions.
Yeah. So this, to me, as someone who teaches the law, is truly one of the most disheartening parts, because I have to teach my students that it means something to file legally binding documents. And then how do I go into class every day and say what you do has the authority of the law, and then Congress issues subpoenas and they're totally ignored? So, a couple of things to think about. One is that not everybody is ignoring it, actually. I think that there's more than a dozen people who have said, I'm going forward. The other thing is that there are some cases that are going to court, and there will be an opinion at some point, I think it's unavoidable, based on how broad this issue of constitutional immunity. So what has the president said? Now, once we started the impeachment inquiry and the subpoenas were supercharged, what has the president said these people are absolutely constitutionally immune from subpoena. What does he mean by that? Yeah, he means this like really weirdly enlarged version of executive privilege. And executive privilege is meant fairly narrowly. Now, do the words executive privilege appear in the Constitution? No. Executive privilege is really something that the Supreme Court recognizes. It's based on the idea that there are some deliberations that the president is entitled to keep private, and there are some matters regarding national security that the president and those around him are entitled to keep private. There's not a lot of good Supreme Court case law on exactly how big executive privilege is, all of the specific times that it applies. But constitutional immunity is different. It's like this enlarged, amorphous version of executive privilege. I don't think that it has a basis in the Supreme Court cases that talk about executive privilege, but you need a court to say that. Now, what has President Trump been most effective at in terms of his domestic policy? Yeah. The federal judiciary. He's been so enormously effective at nominating and getting confirmed federal judges. Federal judges who are rated as disqualified by the not qualified by the American Bar Association, a nonpartisan organization. The latest federal judge who was just confirmed was voted not qualified by the ABA and will now flip the balance of power in the Second Circuit, which will hear his tax return case, I believe. So, excuse me, his financial documents. There's a separate financial documents case. One of the tax return cases, I think, is going to the Supreme Court dealing with his accounting firm, and then I think there's another tax return case waiting in the wings. Who is really, really excited to not hear that tax return case? Chief Justice John Roberts, the new middle of the Supreme Court. And he really, you have to just imagine, what does he not want to do? He doesn't want to preside over an impeachment trial. Okay. He doesn't want to hear these tax return cases. He doesn't want a case about the kind of authority behind subpoenas. But in trying to answer your question, I mean, at some point we will get a judge who says, this is the scope of constitutional immunity for subpoenas. We just don't know which judge it is, and we don't know what the Supreme Court is going to say about it. You know, the kind of one reason to not be too worried about what the Supreme Court is going to say, and I don't think this is a great reason, but I think it's one reason, is that they know they're not making this decision just for President Trump. This is going to be for the next Democratic president as well. And Chief Justice John Roberts absolutely knows that. You know, how many of his colleagues are cognizant of that? I don't know.
Professor Levinson.
Hi.
Hi.
There's no way that you, of all the people in this room, Katie Cooper, can call me Professor Levinson.
Okay, I have a political/legal question.
Yes.
So in the last 2 days of hearings, the Republican counsel has taken this line of questioning, which is, don't you understand why President Trump would be skeptical about about Ukraine and giving Ukraine money, because there's this op-ed that was written that criticized him, and there's this investigative reporter who turned over the Black Ledger. And I don't understand the relevance of that, because that money was appropriated. Presumably it was signed by the president in his budget bill. And so I don't understand, A, what this argument is, and then B, I don't understand why the Democrats don't say this is completely irrelevant. So.
That's a great question. Do we want to open it up, or? You know, so to the question of like, the president wants to make sure that the money is going to be well spent, supposedly. Well, you're right. I mean, I think he didn't have a choice. Like Congress said, this money is for military aid. And all of the career members of the State Department were saying, you have to give this money. And you heard this morning Ambassador Yovanovitch say, like, it would be ludicrous to think that you shouldn't give this money. So, right, and they were making progress. Now, I still think that in a completely different universe, you could say the president has some authority to say, like, tell me about your progress on corruption. You know, tell me about what you're doing. I want to make sure that even though I am going to give over these funds, that I'm giving it in the right way, at the right time, to the right people. I still think that the president has some role there, but that's clearly not what he's doing. And wait, and then the second part of your question, because I got lost in the first.
Why is Schiff allowing this line of questioning? Because it is, I just don't get it, and I don't know why the Democrats don't say, it's too bad if he doesn't want to give the money now. He's already agreed to give the money, and it's over and done with.
So, okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience. My sense is because it took you a couple of sentences to explain it, and then it took me a couple of sentences to think about it, and there's so many attacks that they're just trying to pick their battle. So there's attacks based on like the credibility of the process. There's attacks based on, you know, the substance of the quid pro quo, and then what we haven't even talked about, but we should, there's attacks based on, but they got the money. So what's the issue here? They got the money, and President Zelensky told me that he never had any problem with this. So, you know, so to your question of like, why doesn't Adam Schiff do anything about it? I mean, my sense is because there's just only so many fights that he wants to have and so many explanations he wants to give, but I don't know.
He's got no basis to do that. It's the Republicans' time, 45 minutes between the ranking member and their counsel to ask any questions they want. Schiff's got no control of what Republicans can ask.
But in closing statement, he could have said, I want to point out.
At some point in those 60 days, that money was not going to go. And because they had this conversation, then they continued with the process of following through.
Right. So, okay, so let's focus for a second on this, but I don't understand. They got the money, and didn't they actually get more things than President Obama gave? Didn't they get the, you know, javelins or whatever it was? So, what about that? So they did eventually get the money. It wasn't held up.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, it was after the leak of the whistleblower. So, I mean, this is like, there's a reason that we criminalize attempt. You don't have to be successful. I mean, it's, you know, the bank robber who says, I need $100,000, and then the teller says no and hits the button, and the LAPD shows up. It's still a crime. You still tried just because you didn't get it. I mean, that's a really blunt force example, but you know, this issue, and then the fact that it came out only after there was political pressure and there was transparency about the problems, I think is even more harmful.
On the issue of corrupt intent, Ukraine was known for being corrupt before Trump was elected. And after he got elected, we sold them javelins on several occasions. And neither of those events until Biden was running did he talk about corruption. So if he was so concerned about Ukraine being corrupt and holding up money till he was sure, why didn't he do it on the first two shipments of javelin money? So that's just a factual predicate for that. The other question I wanted to ask you, on the Supreme Court, they don't have the obligation to take on the tax issue. They can abdicate and say, we'll stick with the Second Circuit or whoever it is.
Yeah, so how does the Supreme Court decide to take a case?
Whether there's conflict.
Yes, you need 4 votes. You need 4 people to say, yes, we want this case. Now, there are 4 very conservative members of the court who I think are excited to make some new law. But you typically need either a question of constitutional law or a circuit split. In the Eighth Circuit, you can act this way, but in the Second Circuit, you can only act this way. So we have to go in, even if there's no question of constitutional law, we have to go in and clear it up, because everybody has to know that regardless of whether or not they're in, California or Florida, that everybody can behave a certain way.
The last thing is, given the significance of the Cooperman action and Bolton joining it on the subpoena issue, why do you feel there's been such a drag on the courts to deal with the issue?
What do you mean by, sorry, can you clarify drag on the courts?
Well, this is something that, the impeachment is going on. If they wait 4 or 5 months, it's going to be totally irrelevant if they make a decision, because it'll all be gone. It may be good for future issues, but not now. So it would seem to me it would get fast-tracked.
So, so the great question, which is basically, so Cooperman was the first to sue and say, I need to know whether or not I comply with the subpoena. Bolton tried to join the case. Cooperman said, please don't join the case. And now there's a question as to whether or not Bolton can join. Bolton is, they all kind of bring up slightly different issues, but it's similar enough that I think you could consolidate it. And the question is like, doesn't a federal judge know that you have to make this decision now? How do you fast track a federal case? So where's the Article 3, Claudia, which is, we don't have to put it up, but these are federal judges are appointed for their entire life because they're supposed to be above politics. And if they want to take their time, they can. Now, in this case, you can say, I'm setting expedited briefing. This has to be decided before the impeachment inquiry is over. The judge can. The judge can say, the parties will ask for it, but it's up to the judge to say yes or no. And judges can say, I want you to file by Saturday night. You got to file, the clerks will be in there. Everybody's got to file by Saturday night. But it's also up to the judges to say, these are really complicated issues. And or what, I don't want to be involved in this particular decision at this particular moment.
So if Roberts is so reticent, could he easily just delay it past the election?
It being...
Any of these decisions?
So, Roberts can pressure his 4 conservative colleagues and say, don't vote to take these cases. Yes, so if the Supreme Court does not take a case, then the most recent decision stands. Or if the Supreme Court takes a case and deadlocks, which was the situation when Justice Scalia passed away, then the lower court decision stands, because then there's no Supreme Court decision on the issue. The Supreme Court has, it's interesting because they decided to take the DACA case, which they didn't necessarily have to, but that's going to be a big controversial decision that'll come out by June 30th, 2020. I don't know how many of those decisions they want to have.
I heard just on the news today that the Democrats rescinded those subpoenas so that they would not be part of, they wouldn't go to any judge. And I'm wondering, why would they do that?
So I think that the House Democrats rescinded the Cooperman subpoenas. And they did that because they said, and I think Adam Schiff made this announcement fairly early on, I don't want to get bogged down in the courts. I just want to keep going with the impeachment trial. It was a political calculation, which is essentially, we're not going to fight every subpoena that's ignored. We will just then add that to the articles of impeachment. We'll impeach based on you ignoring the subpoenas. Is it the political calculation I would have made? I don't know. But I think that they don't want to drag this out. And yeah, the Don McGahn, so there's still a subpoena out to Don McGahn. I think that there is not a subpoena out to John Bolton, but they've said that they will, or they could. Don McGahn is a really interesting figure in the Mueller report, of course, and has been absolutely leading the charge of getting the federal judiciary stacked with a lot of really conservative appointees. So in answer to your question, I think that House Democrats decided we can't look like we're going to the courthouse every other second. My response would be, well, that's why we have the courthouse.
2 questions, please. Hi, this guy. Hello.
Hi.
Question number 1. This ignoring the subpoenas thing is very, very frightening to me. Is that almost a constitutional crisis if it's like the enforcement branch won't enforce an order against itself? That's question 1. Question 2 is, I actually missed the first 10 minutes, so if you already answered this, don't answer it again. But isn't high crimes and misdemeanors like the most vague thing ever? Does that actually mean anything, or could that just be whatever we think it means? Thank you.
Okay, question number 2, what's the answer to, isn't high crimes and misdemeanors the most vague thing? Yes. The answer to that is yes. And who was it? Now I'm blanking on it. I don't think it was Lyndon Johnson said impeachable offenses are whatever majority of the Congress says it is at that moment. I mean, that's how vague it is. Now, if you are arrested for felony DUI, is that an impeachable offense? I don't think so. That's a private crime. It certainly has a harm. What type of, not that it matters, but what type of crimes are we talking about? Private crimes or public crimes? Yeah, if you read what the founders thought about when they said kind of what falls within this bucket, it really was misuse of office. It was some type of, and they use this term over and over again, public transgression, abusing the public's trust. So I think that there are a lot of private crimes which are particularly heinous but aren't necessarily impeachable offenses, as strange as that seems. And then there are impeachable offenses which you might not be able to prove as federal crimes. Okay, so the first part of the question was, is this a constitutional crisis? So there's no black letter definition of what constitutional crisis is. I mean, I think that, and there's been a lot of op-eds written about are we there? Yes, we were there 10 months ago. Or is this a constitutional crisis? And I think that, the answer is if you have 2 branches that are fighting and there's no way to end that particular fight, then you could be in a constitutional crisis. But it really would take not just Congress to issue the subpoenas and the executive branch to say, no, don't comply. But I think it would take one more step. It would take a court to say, you need to comply, and the executive branch to say, we're not doing that, to then ignore the tiebreaker, if that makes any sense. Yes, the court should be the tiebreaker. I mean, what happens in most cases when you have a subpoena that's issued, the person doesn't want to comply, there's a conversation, and they say, we're exerting executive privilege over these documents, not over these documents. I'll talk about these issues, but not these issues. And you basically come to some compromise about it. And nobody's really happy, but nobody's really that mad. And this is just this is different. This is a wholesale no. So for constitutional crisis, I think you have to ignore the court.
I've got a couple questions for you.
I thought you would.
Yeah. One of them is probably a softball question, which is, could obstruction demonstrate proof of corrupt intent?
For
bribery, for example.
So obstructing. So using
or say having a meeting with a foreign power to get information for. Is obstruction used to prove corrupt intent?
It could be. That's a great question. It's kind of an after the fact. It's kind of looping back, right, to show, well, you're trying to cover it up, so you must have known at that time that it was wrong. And so that's good circumstantial evidence. It's great evidence that you know now that it's wrong. It's good evidence that you knew then that it was wrong.
Okay, and then the second question is a little bit tougher, and that is, if this impeachment process just crashes and burns, what sort of precedent would we have going forward when a large portion of the population seems to view at least the nature of the problem as being almost like a slam dunk type problem. I mean, are we looking at consequences that have to do with our faith in the legal system and the government itself?
I would say for some part of the population, even if the impeachment inquiry, even if President Trump is impeached, I think some people are already have really shaken faith in the political system and the legal system. My feeling, and I started with this, is that, and this is why we're all here, the Constitution, it's this really brilliant document in a way, but it does assume that people will behave badly, but within a certain bound of badness, so to speak. And the Constitution doesn't really envision, I think, basically two things happening. Not just that you have a president who wants to usurp executive authority and ignore the authority of other branches, but that the other branches won't do anything about it for a long time. And the Constitution assumes that at some point, like in the first two, I think the Constitution assumes that at some point in the first 2 years, regardless of party affiliation, Congress would have said, this is not appropriate. Like, this is just not right. This is why we have these problems. I will also say, people talked about this with respect to the Electoral College before President Trump was even inaugurated. So, in terms of loss of faith, this really is hard for me when I walk into a classroom. Again, I try and train lawyers and say, like, what you do is really important. It's really hard for me when I walk into my undergrad classroom and I'm talking to poli-sci students and I say, what you do is really important. But if you look at what I think are the significant kind of victories where President Trump has been pushed back, it has been largely attorneys going to court. If you think of after the first travel ban, this is kind of off topic to your question, but if you think of what happened, the travel ban was implemented and like 90 minutes later, there were lawyers at LAX holding up signs. And so, and that for my students was really heartening, I think, but it does, that's kind of, we know what happened at the end of the travel ban decision though. After the third iteration, what happened? The majority of the Supreme Court said the president has broad executive authority. So I don't know. I think largely it will depend probably not on the impeachment process, but on the 2020 election. And then there's a big question for the 2020 election. I don't know if we want to end on this note. Like, what happens if the Electoral College does not go in favor of President Trump? Does he leave?
Two questions for you. So one was, you mentioned at your radio show earlier today, you were asked about Giuliani and,
yes.
and about what was your answer? And then I have a second question.
I was asked about, like, why don't we call Rudy Giuliani to the stand? And, I was asked, why don't we call Rudy Giuliani in these impeachment proceedings? And say, a lot of people have been talking about the Ukraine. You've been paid by and working for Ukrainian nationals. 2 of them have been arrested. Would you like to talk to us about that? And my response, potentially naive, is because I think he'll just ignore it. Mm-hmm. And then it will just be another, and he ignored a subpoena. And that I think that House Democrats feel this enormous time pressure to stay on a fairly narrow band of just this kind of potential bribery situation, and that they feel like they have to keep moving before 2020, before the calendar changes.
Okay, so it goes to my other question, which is, what's your view of the whole timing issue? Because we're all going to make the assumption that the Senate is not going to convict, right? Okay, so if there's an impeachment, and then there's an election, and then Trump is either going to be elected or not, right? And let's assume he's elected, and let's assume the Senate flips. So then you have a potential of a conviction that way.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is basically, the House draws up articles of impeachment, then there's an election. The Senate is controlled by Democrats, and at this point, the Senate can vote to convict. I have to say, I don't know. I don't think the Constitution actually gives us the answer for what would happen. I think that practically speaking, there's no way Mitch McConnell will allow that to happen. So it would mean that, well, but, so it would mean that the House Democrats have to continue the impeachment inquiry for 11 and a half months. And I don't see that happening. But that's a fascinating question. So if the Senate flips, then what happens? I mean, the Constitution doesn't say this Senate. It just says, and then the Senate takes it up. I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know where the microphone is.
Right
Yeah.
here, real quick, easy question. Where else can we hear you speak?
Oh, that's so nice.
I know you're on NPR.
Yes.
KCRW. Can you plug in real quick for where else we can listen to you?
Tuesday and Thursday mornings, I'm at LMU from 9:40 to 11:10. Monday and Wednesday night, actually, there's a minor stalker situation. Please don't. It's high security at school. What Claudia's going to say, sometimes here, right? It's all one word. It's my last name and then my first name. And KCRW really wants me to have more followers because they've... I am on Instagram as well. I think it's the same thing. IG handle. Hi, I'm almost 40. It's the same thing. Yes.
To circle back to the last question.
Hi.
Hi. To circle back to the last, I'm wondering, could Nancy Pelosi decide not to press for impeachment, pull back, Trump get reelected, but the Senate flip, and then come back and say, we're going to reopen impeachment hearings?
So I think the more likely scenario is that you draw up new articles of impeachment, that you close this particular impeachment inquiry. I don't see the Senate flipping, but as a thought experiment, let's say that the Senate, sorry, I really don't see the Senate flipping, but I mean, I really haven't kind of contemplated what would happen in a mid-cycle shift. So could Nancy Pelosi just say, we're waiting, slow walk this Adam Schiff? Sure. I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that says it's got to be done quickly. It has to be done within the next 5 days. I think their political calculation is that the American public would just go crazy if the impeachment inquiry lasted a year, and that they would lose more votes. But it's a great question.
Please raise your glasses and give a round of applause to Jessica Levinson. This woman needs a beer. Thank you, Jessica.